My own hands trembled when I touched the violet marks encircling my throat like a necklace of shame. It had been exactly 48 hours since my son Fred had wrapped his fingers around my neck and squeezed until I saw stars dancing before my eyes. 48 hours since I heard my daughter-in-law, Jessica, let out that cold laugh while I struggled to breathe on the floor of my own living room. Hi, I am Barbara Miller. I am 68 years old and I live in a brick house with a shingled roof in a quiet neighborhood here in Ohio. For 43 consecutive years, every morning at 6:30 sharp, I walked 10 blocks to Washington Elementary School, where I taught more than 2,000 children to read and write. My students called me Miss Barbara, even after I got married, because that was how my career had started, and that was how I wanted it to end. When I retired 3 years ago, I thought my moment of peace had finally arrived, my moment to wake up without an alarm clock, to sip my herbal tea slowly on the back patio while listening to the blue jays singing in the oak tree, my moment to knit blankets for my future grandchildren and watch soap operas without having to worry about grading notebooks until the early hours of the morning. But life had other plans for me. Plans that included becoming a prisoner within the same walls where I had dreamed of finding tranquility. Plans that would lead me to discover that my own son, the creature I carried in my womb for 9 months and raised with all the love a mother can give, was capable of trying to take my life with his own hands. The story I'm going to tell you today changed everything I thought I knew about family, about unconditional love, about the limits of what a mother can endure. It is a story that took me from the deepest humiliation to the most empowering moment of my existence. A story that taught me that even at 68, when many think there is no time for drastic changes, we can still surprise ourselves. When I look back, I can clearly see the signs I should have recognized much earlier. But when you are living a nightmare day after day, when the abuse becomes so gradual that it feels like the new normal, it is difficult to realize you are drowning until the water already covers your head completely. It all started in the most innocent way possible. Fred was 35 years old when he lost his job at the auto shop where he had worked for almost 10 years. The economic crisis had hit our town hard, and many small shops were closing or reducing staff. Fred was not the only one left without a job, but he was the one who took the longest to accept that he needed to look for alternatives. During the first months of unemployment, he and Jessica lived off the savings they had and the salary she earned as a sales associate at a clothing store in the mall. It was a modest income enough for a couple without children, but not to maintain the 2-bedroom apartment they rented downtown. Jessica had become part of our family 4 years ago when she and Fred decided to marry after dating for 2 years. She was a thin girl with long, dark hair and eyes that always seemed to be calculating something. She came from a family of market traders, hard-working but tough people, used to fighting for every dollar they earned. At first, my relationship with her was cordial but distant. She was not the type of daughter-in-law I had imagined for Fred. I dreamed of a warmer girl, more family-oriented, perhaps a teacher like me or a nurse, someone with a vocation for service. But Fred seemed happy with her, and that was what mattered to me. The first time they mentioned the possibility of coming to live with me was during a Sunday lunch in March of last year. Fred had been particularly quiet during the meal, barely touching the pot roast I had prepared, especially for him his favorite dish since childhood. "Mom," he finally said to me when we were having tea after lunch, "Jessica and I have been talking about something important." Jessica, who until that moment had been checking her cell phone, looked up and gave him a look I could not decipher. It was as if they had rehearsed that conversation many times before coming. "We are having some financial problems," Fred continued without looking directly into my eyes. "The rent for the apartment is very expensive, and with my current salary, we are not making ends meet." Fred had gotten a job at another shop, but the pay was significantly lower than before. Also, the new job was much further away, which meant more gas money. We thought that maybe if it is not a bother for you, we could stay here for a while, just until our financial situation improves. He finished finally looking up to meet my eyes. My first reaction was surprise, but it quickly transformed into a mixture of maternal compassion and a strange sense of usefulness that I had not felt since my retirement. My house was indeed big for one person. It had 3 bedrooms. Mine, the one that had been Fred's when he lived with me, and a third one that I used for storage, but that could easily become an additional living room. "Of course you can stay," I replied without hesitating too much. "This will always be Fred's house, and therefore yours too, Jessica. We are family." I vividly remember the smile that appeared on Jessica's face at that moment. It was a smile that reached her lips, but not her eyes. A smile that should have served as a warning of what was to come. But at that moment, I interpreted it as relief and gratitude. "Thank you so much, Miss Barbara," she told me with a sweet voice she would rarely use with me again. "I promise it will not be for long. As soon as things get better, we will move to our own place." Fred got up and gave me a tight hug, the kind of hug he had not given me since he was a teenager. "Thanks, Mom. I knew I could count on you." A week later, they arrived with their belongings in 3 taxi trips. They did not have many things. Some boxes of clothes, a small TV, a laptop, some books and magazines, kitchen utensils that Jessica insisted on bringing, even though I already had everything necessary. The first days were almost like a family honeymoon. They settled into Fred's room, which still kept some posters of football teams from his teenage years. Jessica organized her things in the closet with a meticulousness that initially seemed admirable to me. Fred seemed more relaxed than he had been in months, freed from the constant stress of expenses he could not cover. We established a routine that seemed to work for everyone. I got up early as I had done for decades and made breakfast. Fred left for the shop at 7:30. Jessica left for the store at 8. I spent the day doing the usual housework, tending my small vegetable garden in the backyard, reading, watching TV. In the evenings, when they returned from work, we had dinner together at the dining table. We talked about their jobs, about the news, about plans for the weekend. Fred seemed more communicative than he had been in years, telling me anecdotes about his coworkers, about the cars he fixed, about difficult customers. Jessica also participated in these conversations, although her contributions tended to be complaints about her boss, about demanding customers, about how hard it was to work standing up all day. I listened with genuine interest, happy to have young voices in my house again, happy to feel useful and needed. On weekends sometimes we went out to the farmer's market together or went to visit my sister Rachel, who lives in the next town over. They were moments that made me feel like we really were a united family, that my decision to accept them at home had been the right one. But as often happens with situations that seem too good to be true, this family harmony had an expiration date. The changes began subtly, so gradually, that at first I thought it was my imagination or my exaggerated sensitivity as an older woman. The first sign was the issue of housework. During the first few weeks, we all contributed in some way. Fred mowed the lawn on Saturdays and helped with the heavy grocery bags. Jessica occasionally washed the dishes or swept the patio, but little by little, these contributions became spaced out until they disappeared completely. The transition was so gradual that it is difficult to pinpoint exactly when it stopped being collaboration and became unilateral expectation. One day, Fred did not mow the lawn because he had a backache. The next week because it had rained and the grass was wet. The third week, he simply did not mention it. And when I mowed the lawn on Sunday morning, he watched me from the window without offering help. With Jessica, the process was even more subtle. She started forgetting to wash the dishes she used for breakfast, leaving them in the sink for later. When she came home in the evenings, she always had some justification for not helping. She was very tired. Her feet hurt. She had to study for a course she had started taking online. "Miss Barbara," she would say to me with that smile that no longer reached her eyes, "I hope you do not mind that I leave these little plates here. It is just that I arrive so exhausted that I can barely stand up. How could I refuse? How was I going to look like the bad mother-in-law who does not understand the difficulties of a working daughter-in-law?" So I washed her dishes, picked up her things, cleaned the mess she left in the bathroom. Slowly, imperceptibly, I was becoming the unpaid maid of my own house. And the most painful thing of all is that for a long time, I did not realize that was exactly what was happening. Now, when I think about those first months, I wonder how I could be so blind, so naive, so desperately in need of feeling useful and loved, that I did not see the warning signs that were right in front of my nose. But I guess when you have spent your whole life caring for others, first, your parents, then your husband, then your son, then 2,000 students, over 4 decades, it is hard to realize you are being taken advantage of. It is hard to distinguish between giving out of love and being exploited for convenience. The line between being a generous hostess and being a victim of emotional and financial abuse is thinner than many people imagine. And that line becomes even blurrier when the people mistreating you are the ones who are supposed to love and respect you the most in this world. But I am getting ahead of myself in my story. Now I must tell you exactly how a 68-year-old woman who had spent her entire life being respected by her students' colleagues and neighbors ended up being strangled by her own son in her own living room while her daughter-in-law laughed as if she were watching a comedy on television. I must tell you how that same woman found the strength she did not know she had to completely change that situation in the most unexpected and definitive way possible. Because this story, although it began with humiliation and violence, ends with something I never thought I would be able to experience at my age: true freedom. Tell me here in the comments where you are watching this video from, what is your city, your country? Have you gone through a similar situation in your family? And if you have not subscribed to the Elderly Stories channel, yet subscribe now. Because every week I bring real stories of people like me who went through difficult times but found the strength to change their lives. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss any videos. But what really happened during those following months, what led me to that terrible moment when I felt my son's hands around my throat, began with changes that at first seemed so small, I almost did not notice them. The changes began on a rainy Tuesday in May, exactly 3 months after Fred and Jessica moved into my house. I remember the date precisely because it was the day I always went to the bank to collect my pension, a routine I had kept religiously for the 3 years since my retirement. That morning, I got up as always at 6. I made breakfast for the 3 of us and got ready to leave. Jessica had already left early because she had inventory at the store, but Fred was still at home, which surprised me because he normally left at 7:30. I found him sitting at the kitchen table still in pajamas with an expression I had not seen on his face before. It was not sadness or worry. It was something colder, more calculated. He had his phone in his hands, but he was not using it. He was simply turning it between his fingers while looking at me with those eyes that I no longer recognized as those of the boy I had raised. "Mom," he said to me with a strangely formal tone, "I need to talk to you about something important before you go out." My heart accelerated immediately. I thought maybe he had lost his job again, or that Jessica was pregnant, or that they had decided to move. Any of those options would have filled me with different emotions, but none prepared me for what I was actually about to hear. I sat in front of him, leaving my purse and keys on the table. The rain beat against the kitchen windows, creating a constant rhythm that somehow made the silence between us even more uncomfortable. The situation in this house needs to change. Fred began looking directly into my eyes with an intensity that made me feel like I was being interrogated. "Jessica and I have been talking, and there are things that are not working." What kind of things, I asked, although a part of me already feared the answer. "Mom, you have to understand that now we are a family here. A family works when each person fulfills their specific role. My role is to work outside the home and contribute financially. Jessica's role is to help with income and manage certain aspects of the household. And your role," he paused so long that I thought maybe he had changed his mind about what he was going to say, but no. He was just carefully choosing the words he would use to completely destroy the image I had of my place in my own home. Your role is to keep the house running. Cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, doing the shopping, all those things a house needs to function well, it is your natural contribution to this family. The words fell on me like blocks of ice. I could not believe what I was hearing. My own son was officially assigning me the role of maid in my own house, and he was doing it with the coldness of a manager explaining job responsibilities to a new employee, Fred. I managed to say, after several seconds of silent shock, I am not the employee of this house. This is my house, son. I live here because it is mine, not because you allow me to be here. His expression did not change. If anything, it became even harder. Mom, let's be realistic. Who pays the electric bill? Who pays the water? Who buys the food? Your pension does not even cover half the expenses of this house. If it were not for our salaries, you could not maintain this place. It was a lie. My pension was modest but sufficient for my basic needs, and I had been contributing proportionally to the expenses since they arrived. But Fred had distorted the numbers to create a narrative in which I was a financial burden instead of the owner of the house who had generously opened her doors. Besides, he continued without giving me a chance to respond. You are retired. You do not have a job. You do not have responsibilities outside the home. It is logical that you take charge of the housework. We work 8 hours a day outside the home. When we arrive, we want to find the house clean and the food ready. It is not too much to ask. It is not too much to ask. I repeated his words, feeling like I was having a nightmare from which I could not wake up. Fred, I worked 43 years of my life. I got up at 5:30 in the morning for 4 decades to go teach. Now I have the right to rest, to do things at my own pace. Mom resting does not mean being a burden to the family. If you want to live here, you have to contribute something. And what you can contribute is keeping the house running. The word burden resonated in my head like a painful echo. My own son had just called me a burden. Me, who had raised him alone after his father died. Me, who had worked double shifts for years to give him education and opportunities. Me, who had sacrificed my youth, my personal dreams, my chances of rebuilding my love life. All for him. If you do not like the proposal, he added with a cold smile, I will never forget. You can always look for another place to live, but if you decide to stay here, these are the rules. I got up from the chair feeling dizzy. I could not fully process what I had just heard. I left the house to go to the bank as I had planned, but I walked through the streets like a zombie without really seeing anything around me. At the bank, while I waited in line to collect my pension, I tried to analyze rationally what had happened. Maybe Fred was going through a difficult time at work. Maybe the financial pressure had made him irritable. Maybe he just needed time to realize how unfair his proposal was. But when I returned home 2 hours later, I found evidence that Fred was completely serious. There was a handwritten list taped to the refrigerator door, a list of chores with my name at the top. Mom's responsibilities, the title said, written in Jessica's handwriting. Below was a detailed list. Monday, laundry, clean bathrooms, prepare special lunch. Tuesday, general house cleaning, ironing, grocery shopping. Monday, Wednesday, clean windows, organize closets, prepare special dinner. And so it went day by day until Sunday, which included deep cleaning of the whole house and meal prep for the following week. I stood in front of that list for several minutes, reading it over and over again, trying to convince myself it was some kind of cruel joke. But it was not a joke. It was a work schedule, like the ones we used at school to organize student activities. I tore the list off the refrigerator and went straight to Fred's room. I knocked on the door harder than I intended. Fred, I need to talk to you right now. He came out of the room with an annoyed expression as if I were an annoying salesperson interrupting his nap. What is this? I asked him, waving the list in front of his face. It is exactly what it says. It is Mom. An organization of the tasks you are going to do. Jessica was kind enough to write it down so you do not forget anything. Jessica made a chore list for me in my own house. Yes, Mom. Jessica is very organized with these things. She thinks that if she has everything written down, it will be easier for you to remember what to do each day. The humiliation of knowing that my daughter-in-law had the audacity to make a chore list for me, as if I were a new employee needing instructions, was almost as painful as my son's betrayal in allowing it. Fred, I am not going to follow this list. I am not your employee. I am your mother, and this is my house. His expression changed drastically. The mask of patience fell off, revealing a coldness that scared me. Mom, we already talked about this morning. If you want to stay here, these are the conditions. If you do not like them, you know where the door is. That night, when Jessica returned from work, she was waiting for me in the living room. I wanted to hear from her own lips the justification for that list. Jessica, I told her as calmly as I could, I need you to explain why you made a chore list for me. She sat on the sofa with the comfort of someone who feels completely like the owner of the place. She did not even look ashamed or uncomfortable. Oh, Miss Barbara, do not get like that. It is just to organize ourselves better. A house does not maintain itself right. And since you have all the time in the world, I have all the time in the world because I earned it working 43 years. I interrupted her. Well, yes, but that time has passed. Now you are retired and we are working. It is natural that the person who is at home takes charge of things around the house. Fred appeared from the kitchen with a beer in his hand, as if he had been waiting for this conversation to make his triumphal entry. Mom Jessica is right. You cannot live here as if you were a guest in a hotel. We all have to contribute in some way. Contribute. But this is my house. I am giving you a roof. I am sharing my space. Your house, which you could not maintain without our financial help. Fred cut me off. Mom, be realistic. Without our salaries, you would have to sell this house or go live in a nursing home. Those words were like a slap in the face. A nursing home. My own son was threatening to send me to a nursing home if I did not accept being his free maid. Besides, added Jessica with that fake smile, I was starting to hate. It is not so terrible, just normal house chores. Any housewife does them every day. I am not your housewife. I am the owner of this house. On paper, maybe said Fred with a tone that froze my blood. But in practice, this house runs on our money, and whoever puts up the money makes the rules. That night, I could not sleep. I stayed awake until 4 a.m, turning that conversation over in my head. How had I reached this point? How had I raised a son capable of treating me that way? Where had I gone wrong, but more importantly, what was I going to do about it? The following days were a nightmare of gradual humiliations. Fred and Jessica began to implement their system of rules with an efficiency that suggested they had been planning it for a long time. Every morning after they left for work, I found little notes stuck all over the house. Mom, today I need you to wash my work uniform and leave it well ironed for tomorrow. Miss Barbara, you forgot to clean the bathroom mirror yesterday. Please do it today. Mom, last night's food was very salty. Be careful with that. Every note was like a small stab of authority. They had become my supervisors, and I had been demoted to the role of maid with constant performance evaluations. But the most painful thing was not the tasks themselves. I had been doing housework all my life, and I did not mind cleaning or cooking. The painful thing was the attitude, the way they spoke to me as if I were an employee. They could scold if I did not meet their expectations. Fred developed the habit of inspecting my work when he got home. He walked around the house checking that everything was clean and tidy, exactly as he wanted. If he found something he did not like, he came to find me to let me know his disapproval. Mom, there is dust on the dining table. You did not clean it today. Mom, these dishes are not completely dry. You have to dry them better after washing. Mom, my shirt is not well ironed. Look here, it has wrinkles on the sleeves. Each criticism was expressed with a tone of forced patience, as if he were a boss trying to be understanding with an incompetent employee, but who had no choice but to keep her. Jessica adopted a different but equally effective strategy. She never gave me direct orders. Instead, she made casual comments that made it very clear what she expected from me. Oh, how delicious it smells of food when one arrives from work and everything is already ready. At my mom's house, it was always like that. I love arriving and finding clean and folded clothes in my room. That is real comfort. My grandmother always said that a house shows when it has a woman who really knows how to take care of it. These comments were worse than direct orders because they forced me to guess exactly what she wanted. And if I did not guess correctly, the indirect complaints came. "Oh, Miss Barbara, I see that today you did not have time to sweep the patio." Do not worry. It happens to all of us that we forget things sometimes. What a pity you could not go to the market today. We were going to make that new recipe we saw on TV. The implication was always the same. I had failed in my responsibilities, but they were generous enough to forgive my incompetence. Gradually, my daily schedule began to be structured completely around their needs and expectations. I got up at 5:30 to have breakfast ready when they woke up. I spent the morning doing the cleaning, laundry, and organization tasks they considered necessary. In the afternoon, I went to the market to buy the ingredients for the dinner they had suggested. At the end of the day, I had to have dinner prepared and served exactly when they arrived from work. My life had been reduced to an endless series of household chores, oriented to satisfy the needs and desires of two people who behaved like my employers instead of my family. But the most painful transformation was not in my daily routine, but in the way they treated me as a person. Gradually, I ceased to be Mom or Miss Barbara to become a background presence almost invisible, expected to function efficiently without requiring attention or consideration. When they got home, they no longer asked me how my day had been. They did not tell me about their jobs or their plans. They simply expected dinner to be ready, and for me to disappear discreetly while they ate and watched TV. If I tried to participate in their conversations, I received short answers and looks that clearly indicated my participation was not welcome. It was as if my only function was to keep the house running, and any attempt to exist as an individual person was a nuisance. The emotional breaking point came one Friday night, 2 months after the initial conversation with Fred. I had spent the whole day preparing a special dinner because it was Jessica's birthday. I bought expensive ingredients with my own money, cooked for 4 hours, decorated the table with flowers from the garden. When they arrived home and saw the special dinner, Jessica's reaction was not one of gratitude, but of criticism. "Oh, Miss Barbara, why did you bother so much? We were going out to dinner for my birthday. Now we feel obliged to stay here so as not to waste your work." They sat down to eat, but the whole conversation was about how inconvenient my surprise had been, how I had ruined their plans, how I had not thought to consult before doing something so elaborate. That night, after washing all the dishes from the dinner I had prepared with so much love, I locked myself in my room and cried until I ran out of tears. For the first time since Fred was a child, I felt completely alone and worthless in my own home. But what I did not know that night was that the humiliations I had experienced up to that moment were only the prelude to something much worse. Fred and Jessica were just beginning to show how far they were willing to go to keep me completely subjected to their desires. The true cruelty was about to begin, and it would lead me to that terrible moment when I would feel my own son's hands around my throat, fighting to breathe while listening to my daughter-in-law's laughter echoing in my ears. True cruelty began during the first week of August. I had developed the habit of getting up even earlier at 5 in the morning to start the coffee and warm up the house before Fred and Jessica woke up. It was my silent way of rebelling against the situation. If I was going to be treated like an employee, at least I would be the best employee possible, so efficient that they could not find excuses to complain. But that strategy backfired. Instead of earning respect, I only established an even higher standard of service that they began to consider normal and then insufficient. It was a Wednesday morning when Jessica came down to breakfast with a particularly annoyed expression. She sat at the table without greeting me. checked her phone while I poured her coffee and served toast, and then dropped a bomb that would completely change the dynamic of our coexistence. "Jessica, Miss Barbara," she told me without looking up from her screen. "My friends from work are coming for lunch here on Saturday. I need you to prepare something special to impress them." My first reaction was genuine surprise, not because it bothered me to cook for visitors, but because it was the first time I heard about this plan. "How many friends?" I asked, trying to keep a neutral tone. "6, maybe 7, if Mary can come. I want to do an elegant lunch, something that shows we know how to live well." Fred, who until that moment had been eating in silence, looked up to add his own contribution to the conversation. "Mom, this is the kind of thing we talked about when we said you had to contribute more to the family. Jessica needs to look good with her friends from work. It is important for her career." Of course, I answered automatically, although inside I was beginning to feel that familiar sensation of being manipulated. "What kind of food did you have in mind?" Jessica's eyes lit up with an emotion I had not seen since her first days in my house. She straightened in her chair and began to talk with the enthusiasm of someone who had been planning this for a long time. "Well, I thought of an appetizer, main course, and dessert. For the appetizer, maybe some savory tarts or mini quiches, but homemade, not store-bought. For the main course, roasted chicken with potatoes and vegetables, but presented nicely like in restaurants. And for dessert, that flan you make that turns out so rich. It was a menu that would take me at least 6 hours to prepare, not counting shopping time. But what bothered me most was not the work itself, but the way she was presenting it, as if it were my obligation to impress her friends, to benefit her social image. And Miss Barbara continued Jessica with that smile I had learned to fear. "I also need you to fix up the house especially well. That day, have everything perfect, okay? These women have very good taste, and I do not want them to think we live like people." "Well, you understand." No, I did not understand, or rather, I understood too well what she was really telling me, that my usual level of cleanliness was not good enough for her elegant friends. Saturday arrived with intermittent rain that made the air even colder than usual. I had started preparation at 5 in the morning, making the dough for the tarts, marinating the chicken, preparing the ingredients for the flan. Fred and Jessica got up late and had breakfast while I worked in the kitchen, making occasional comments about my progress as if they were quality inspectors. "Mom, those tarts look a little big. Shouldn't they be smaller and more elegant? Miss Barbara, are you sure that chicken is going to be juicy? It looks a little dry from here." By 11 in the morning, when Jessica's friends were scheduled to arrive, I had transformed my house into something I did not recognize. Every surface had been polished until it shined. There were fresh flowers in every room. The dining table was set with my best china and linens. But when the doorbell rang and the guests began to arrive, I discovered that my work was just beginning. Jessica's friends were women between 30 and 40 years old, all well-dressed and made up with the confidence of people who are used to being served. They arrived, speaking loudly, laughing, filling my house with an energy that immediately made me feel like an intruder in my own space. Jessica introduced me to each of them, but not as her mother-in-law or the lady of the house. She introduced me as Barbara, who helps us with things around the house. The implication was clear. I was the service staff. "How lucky you are," Jessica exclaimed a woman named Patricia after tasting the tarts. "To have someone who cooks so well, I have to do everything myself in my house." "Yes," replied Jessica with that fake smile. "Barbara is very good at these things. She has a lot of experience." During the next 3 hours, I became the invisible maid of my own house. I served the plates, cleared the dirty silverware, refilled wine glasses, immediately cleaned any spill or crumb that fell to the floor. The women talked about their jobs, their husbands, their vacation plans, as if I were not present. When they needed something, they told Jessica, "Could you ask Barbara to bring more bread," instead of addressing me directly. But the most humiliating thing came when they started making comments about my food and service as if I were deaf. "This tart is delicious, but maybe a little salty for my taste. The chicken is fine, although I would have seasoned it differently. The dessert is rich, but my housekeeper makes a similar one that is creamier." Every comment was an evaluation of my performance, made without regard for my feelings or dignity. These women had come to my house, eaten my food, enjoyed my hospitality, and treated me as if I were a culinary machine without emotions. When they finally left around 4 in the afternoon, I was physically and emotionally exhausted. I had been on my feet for 11 hours, straight, had cooked for 8 people, had served 3 full courses, and had cleaned constantly throughout the event. My first expectation was that Jessica would at least appreciate the effort, but when the last guests walked out the door, she came to the kitchen where I was starting to wash the mountain of dirty dishes, and instead of gratitude, I received criticism. "Miss Barbara, the tarts were a little salty next time. Try to use less salt, and when you serve the wine, try not to make noise with the bottle against the glasses. It is very noticeable. Oh, and one of my friends commented that you looked a little disheveled. For next time, maybe you could fix yourself up a little more when we have visitors." Disheveled. After 11 hours of intense work, after sweating over the stove and running from one side to the other, serving her friends, she thought my problem was that I looked disheveled. That night, after washing all the dishes, cleaning the kitchen, and putting away the leftovers, I collapsed on my bed, feeling something I had never experienced before in my own home: shame of myself. Shame for having allowed myself to be treated that way. Shame for having smiled and served women who had treated me as if I were invisible. Shame for having betrayed the Barbara, who had been a respected teacher, a dignified professional, a woman with self-worth. But the humiliation of Jessica's lunch turned out to be only the first act of a much crueler play, because Fred had been watching the whole dynamic, had seen how submissive I had become, and had decided it was time to implement the next level of his plan. The following Monday, when I arrived in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, as I had been doing for months, I found another list taped to the refrigerator. But this one was not like the previous ones. This one was much more detailed, more specific, and more humiliating. "New rules for the operation of the house," the title said, written in Fred's handwriting. The list included things like 1. Mom must have breakfast ready exactly at 6:30 a.m. If it is not ready at that time, breakfast will not be served that day. The house must be completely clean before 9 a.m. every day. This includes vacuuming, mopping, cleaning bathrooms, and making beds. 3. Lunch must be prepared by 12:30 p.m. every day, even if we are not going to be home. The food must be kept warm in case we decide to return. Mom cannot use the living room TV between 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. That is our relaxation time. 5. Mom cannot receive visitors without prior permission from Fred and Jessica. Mom must keep herself presentable at all times. This means being dressed appropriately and with hair done before 7 a.m. There were 17 rules in total. 17 ways in which my son and daughter-in-law had decided to control every aspect of my existence in my own home. I read the list 3 times, each time feeling smaller, more insignificant, more trapped. They were not suggestions or requests, they were orders. And the clear implication was that if I did not follow them, there would be consequences. When Fred came down for breakfast that morning, I had the list in my hands and was trembling with indignation. "What is this?" I asked him, waving the paper in front of him. "It is exactly what it says it is, Mom. Rules so the house runs better. Jessica and I have noticed that lately you have been a little careless with some things. We thought having everything in writing would help. Fred, these are not rules for a house. This is like a rule book for an employee." "Well," he replied with that cold smile he had perfected. If the shoe fits, I was speechless. My own son had just confirmed that he considered me his employee, not his mother, not the owner of the house where he lived for free, not the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him, his employee. And Mom, he added while spreading butter on his toast with the casualness of someone discussing the weather. "If any of these rules bother you too much, you can always move to a place where you do not have to follow them. But as long as you live in this house, this is what we expect." That veiled threat became the constant background of my life during the following weeks. Every morning I woke up knowing that every small action would be evaluated according to those 17 rules. Every meal I prepared, every surface I cleaned, every interaction I had with them was subject to their system of inspection and criticism, and they took their role as supervisors very seriously. Fred developed the habit of making inspection rounds when he arrived from work, walking through the whole house with an air of authority that reminded me of the inspectors from the Department of Education who occasionally visited my school. "Mom, there is dust on this shelf. Did you not clean it today? Mom, this food is too seasoned. Remember, we do not like very spicy food. Mom, your clothes look wrinkled. Did you not read the rule about keeping yourself presentable?" Jessica adopted a more subtle approach but equally effective. She made casual comments that clearly referenced the rules without mentioning them directly. "Oh, how nice to arrive home and find everything perfectly clean." It shows when someone really follows an organized system. I love that the food is always ready exactly on time. That shows true professionalism. It is so nice to have the house quiet in the evenings, each person in their space, without bothering each other. Every comment was a reminder that my behavior was being monitored and evaluated constantly. I could not relax even for a moment because any deviation from their expectations would result in criticism or worse, in threats of expulsion. Gradually, I began to develop physical symptoms of constant stress. My hands developed a slight tremor, which was especially noticeable when serving tea or writing. I started having frequent headaches, especially in the afternoons after a full day of walking on tiptoes around their demands. My sleep patterns became erratic. I woke up several times each night worrying about the next day's tasks, mentally reviewing the list of rules to make sure I had not forgotten anything. Some nights I got up at 3 in the morning to check that the kitchen was completely clean, terrified that Fred would find some problem during his morning inspection. But the most painful change was not physical, but emotional. Gradually, I began to lose the sense of who I was as a person. For 43 years, I had been Miss Barbara, respected by her colleagues, loved by her students, recognized in her community as an educated and dignified woman. Now I was simply Mom, the maid of my own house, whose only value lay in her ability to keep the house running, according to other people's specifications. I stopped looking in the mirror because I did not recognize the woman reflected there. It was a hunched woman with deep dark circles, with the constantly anxious expression of someone living in a state of permanent alert. It was a woman who had learned to walk silently, to speak in a low voice, to make herself invisible, to avoid conflict. My few friends who still visited me occasionally began to comment on my personality change. "Barbara, you look very tired lately. Are you okay, Barbara? Before you were so talkative. Now you barely speak when I come to visit." But I could not explain to them what was happening. How could I admit that my own son had turned me into his servant? How could I confess that I had lost control of my own life in my own home? The shame was too great, the humiliation too deep. So I lied. I said I was tired because of age, that having young people at home required a lot of energy, that I was happy to be able to help my son during a difficult time. Lies that sounded noble and maternal, but hid a much darker reality. The straw that broke the camel's heart came during the second week of October, when temperatures began to rise. Fred had had a particularly stressful week at work, and that meant his domestic inspections had become even more rigorous than usual. That afternoon when he arrived home, I was finishing ironing his work clothes for the next day. It had been a long day. I'd washed all the house laundry, cleaned the 3 bathrooms, prepared the lunch they had not come to eat, did the shopping for dinner, and cooked a full dinner that was now waiting in the oven. Fred entered the house with a particularly somber expression. He did not greet me, as had been his custom for the last few months. He simply left his backpack on the floor and began his routine inspection. First, he went to the kitchen, where he opened the oven to check dinner. Then he went to the dining room, where he ran his finger over the table surface to verify there was no dust. Then he checked the bathrooms, the living room, and finally arrived at his room, where he found the clothes I had been ironing. He He took one of his shirts, held it up against the window to examine it against the light, and then I saw something in his expression that scared me. It was not just annoyance or criticism, it was pure rage. "Mom!" he shouted with a voice that made the windows shake. "Come here right now!" I ran to his room with my heart pounding with terror. In all the months of criticism and humiliation, he had never yelled at me with that intensity. "What is this?" he roared, shaking the shirt in front of my face. "Is this what you call ironing?" I looked at the shirt, desperately trying to see what I had done wrong. It looked perfectly ironed to me, but clearly he had found some defect. "Fred, No, do not call me Fred. This shirt is full of wrinkles. Look here and here and here." He pointed to areas that to my eyes looked perfectly smooth, but his rage was so intense I did not dare contradict him. "I am sorry, son. I can iron it again." "Of course you are going to iron it again, and this time you are going to do it right. I am sick of your shoddy work." That was when the moment arrived that would change everything forever. Fred approached me with the shirt still in his hands, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes that terrified me to the bone. It was not just rage. It was something much darker, much more dangerous. And it was in that moment I understood that the escalation of humiliations had reached its final point, and that what came next would be something from which I could never return. What followed in that room forever changed the nature of our relationship. Fred got so close to me that I could feel his hot breath on my face. His eyes had an expression I had never seen before, not even during his worst teenage tantrums. It was a cold, calculating look, but at the same time filled with a fury that seemed to have been accumulating for months. "Mom," he told me with a dangerously low voice, "I think you are not understanding what your situation is here." My heart began to beat so hard I was sure he could hear it. Something in his tone told me this conversation would not be like the previous ones. This would not be a simple criticism about my housework or a veiled threat about finding another place to live. This was something more serious, more definitive. "Fred, I just want to do things right," I began to say. But he cut me off with a sharp gesture of his hand. "Shut up. When I am talking, you shut up and listen." He had never spoken to me that way. Not even when he was a rebellious teenager had he used that tone of absolute authority with me. It was as if he had been practicing this conversation, preparing for this moment when he would finally establish the definitive rules of our coexistence. "You seem to have trouble understanding simple concepts." He continued, starting to walk from one side of the room to the other, like a general giving orders to his troops. "So I am going to explain it to you one more time, but this time I want to be completely sure you understand." He stopped in front of me and bent down slightly so his eyes were level with mine. The gesture was clearly intimidating, designed to make me feel small and helpless. "This house runs on our money. Without mine and Jessica's salary, you could not pay even half of the monthly expenses. Your retired teacher's pension is a pittance that is not enough for anything. Is that clear so far?" I nodded silently, although deep down I knew he was exaggerating our financial contribution. Yes, they helped with expenses, but my pension covered a significant part of the house costs. However, at that moment, I did not dare contradict him. "Good. Second point. You are living here by our generosity. We could easily rent an apartment and leave you alone here struggling to pay all the bills with your ridiculous pension. But we do not do it because we are good people who take care of family. Is that also clear?" I nodded again, feeling smaller and smaller with every word that came out of his mouth. "Third, and this is the most important, if you want to continue living here, you have to earn that privilege every day. And the only way to earn it is by being useful, keeping this house spotless, cooking delicious meals, and doing everything we need without complaining or making a face." The word privilege resonated in my head like a painful echo. Living in my own home had become a privilege I had to earn daily, according to my own son. And fourth, he added with a smile that froze my blood, If you fail in any of these aspects, if your work is not up to our standards, or if we have a conversation like this again because you cannot iron a simple shirt correctly, then we are going to have to reconsider this whole arrangement. Do you understand me clearly? Yes, Fred. I whispered, feeling as if the words were being torn from my throat. Perfect. Now go iron that shirt again, and this time do it right, because I do not want to have to repeat this conversation. I left the room with my legs shaking and the shirt in my hands. I went to the ironing board in the kitchen, but my hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the iron. For the next 20 minutes, I worked that shirt until every fiber was perfectly smooth, checking it over and over under different lights to make sure there was not the slightest wrinkle. When I returned to Fred's room with the re-ironed shirt, he examined it meticulously under the ceiling lamp, checking every inch as if he were a quality inspector in a textile factory. Better, he said finally, hanging the shirt in his closet. I see that you can do things right when you set your mind to it. Remember this standard for the future. That night, I could not eat. Fear and humiliation had formed a knot in my stomach that made it impossible to swallow anything. I sat at the table with Fred and Jessica while they ate dinner and discussed their plans for the weekend. But I just moved the food around on my plate, unable to bring anything to my mouth. Miss Barbara observed Jessica. "You are not eating. Do you feel okay?" "I am fine," I lied. "I am just not very hungry." "You must eat," insisted Fred with that new authority in his voice. "You cannot fulfill your responsibilities if you do not feed yourself properly. My responsibilities." Even my eating had been reduced to a utilitarian function related to my ability to serve them. The following days passed in a fog of hypervigilance and constant anxiety. Every task I performed was done with the meticulousness of someone who knows she is being watched and evaluated. I ironed every garment 3 times before considering it finished. I cleaned every surface until it shined. I cooked every meal as if my life depended on the perfection of the result. But no matter how much effort I put in, there was always something that could be criticized. The soup was too hot or too cold. The dishes were not completely dry after washing. There was a microscopic spot on the bathroom mirror that I had overlooked. Fred had developed what I can only describe as an addiction to criticism. He seemed to get genuine pleasure from finding faults in my work, no matter how insignificant. And every criticism came accompanied by a reminder of what would happen if my performance did not improve. "Mom, this rice is a little sticky. I hope tomorrow you remember to cook better because we are not going to tolerate low-quality food indefinitely. Mom, you forgot to clean the base of the toilet. These little details matter if you want to keep this house in acceptable condition. Mom, your clothes look wrinkled again. We already talked about the importance of keeping yourself presentable." Jessica had adopted a role of assistant supervisor that in some ways was even more humiliating than Fred's direct criticisms. She made apparently casual comments that were actually evaluations of my performance. Oh, how delicious the kitchen smells when someone really knows how to season food correctly. I love arriving home and finding everything so well organized. It shows when someone puts real effort into their work. It is a blessing to have someone at home who understands the importance of small details. Every compliment was actually a subtle way of reminding me that my value as a person depended entirely on my ability to maintain their satisfaction with my housework. But the most painful thing was not the constant criticism, but the way they had managed to convince me that I deserved it. Gradually, I began to internalize their standards as my own. When I found a small imperfection in my work, I felt genuinely guilty, as if I had failed not only them, but myself. I developed a self-criticism routine that was even more rigorous than their inspections. Every night before going to bed, I mentally reviewed everything I had done during the day, looking for mistakes, planning how I could improve the next day. I had become my own harshest supervisor. The few times I managed to do something they considered exceptional, the feeling of relief and satisfaction was so intense it had become addictive. I lived for those rare moments when Fred said, "Good job, Mom," or when Jessica commented that the food was perfect. Those small recognitions had become the only source of self-esteem I had left. My outer world had shrunk until it almost completely disappeared. I stopped receiving friends because there was always some urgent task to do. I stopped going to church on Sundays because that was the day designated for weekly deep cleaning. I stopped reading, listening to music, doing any of the activities that used to give me pleasure. My identity as Miss Barbara the teacher, the educated woman, the person with her own thoughts and interests had been systematically eroded until the only thing left was my function as the house maintainer. It was as if I had forgotten that I was ever anything other than an unpaid maid. The final break came during the last week of October, on a day that had started like any other, but would end up changing everything forever. It was a Friday, and I had spent the week preparing for another lunch Jessica had organized this time to celebrate a coworker's birthday. I had spent 2 days cooking elaborate dishes, decorating the house, making sure everything was perfect according to the increasingly high standards they had established. The lunch had gone well. The guests had praised the food. The house looked spotless, and for once it seemed Jessica was genuinely satisfied with my work. After the last guests left, I was in the kitchen washing the mountain of dishes and utensils left over from the event. Fred arrived from work earlier than usual, apparently in a good mood because of some positive news he had received at the shop. He entered the kitchen, whistling a tune I did not recognize, and for a moment I thought maybe he would congratulate me on the success of the lunch. Instead, he went to the refrigerator, grabbed a beer, and started telling me about his plans for the weekend. He and Jessica had decided to go visit her family in Chicago and would be gone until Sunday night. "Mom," he told me. While opening his beer, "We are taking advantage of the fact that we will not be here, so you can do a complete cleaning of the whole house. I want everything to be perfect when we return on Sunday. And when I say perfect, I mean every corner, every surface, every detail must be spotless." I nodded automatically, although inside I felt a familiar pang of resentment. After 2 intensive days preparing lunch, the prospect of spending a whole weekend cleaning the house from top to bottom exhausted me just thinking about it. "Also," continued Fred, "I need you to wash and iron all our clothes for next week and reorganize our closet because it is a little messy. Oh, and clean the windows on the outside too because they look dirty." The list kept growing for the next 10 minutes. By the time he finished, he had added enough tasks to keep me busy all weekend without a moment of rest. "And Mom," he added almost as an afterthought, "we do not want you to receive visitors while we are away. We need to know that you are going to be focused on your work, not distracted with unnecessary socializing." That restriction was the straw that broke the camel's back. Not only had they turned me into their unpaid maid, but now they also controlled my social life, deciding when and with whom I could interact. "Fred," I said, surprising myself by using a firmer tone than I had used in months, "I think you are asking too much. I also need time to rest." The silence that followed was deafening. Fred stood motionless with the beer halfway to his mouth, looking at me as if I had said something completely incomprehensible. Slowly, he lowered the beer and turned to look directly at me. "Excuse me," he said with a dangerously calm voice. "Are you telling me you are not going to do what I ask?" "I am not saying that," I replied quickly, already regretting having spoken. "I am just saying that maybe we could distribute the work differently." Mom Fred interrupted me, and something in his tone made my blood freeze. "I think we need to have another serious conversation." Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway at that moment as if she had been waiting for this confrontation. She leaned against the door frame with her arms crossed, clearly preparing to enjoy the show. "Sit down," Fred ordered me, pointing to a chair at the kitchen table. I sat obediently, feeling like a child about to be scolded for bad behavior. "It seems you have forgotten some important things we discussed a few weeks ago." Fred began, starting to walk around the table as he spoke. "Specifically, it seems you have forgotten your place in this house and what your responsibilities are." "Fred, No!" he roared with an intensity that made me jump in the chair. "Do not speak when I am speaking." The volume of his voice was so sudden and so violent that I was paralyzed with shock. In all the time I had known him, he had never yelled at me with that fury. "You are going to listen to what I have to say, and you are not going to interrupt even once, is that clear?" I nodded, feeling tears forming in my eyes. "Good, now I am going to remind you of some basic truths that you seem to have forgotten." First truth: this house is maintained with our money. Without us, you would be living on the street or in a nursing home. Second truth: your only contribution to this family is doing housework. Third truth: if you cannot fulfill those tasks without complaining, then you have no value to us. Every word was like a stab at my self-esteem. Fred had reduced my entire existence to my usefulness as a maid and was making it very clear that even that usefulness was questionable. Fourth truth: he continued getting closer to where I was sitting. "You are a useless old woman who should be grateful that someone wants her in their house. Any other family would have sent a woman like you to a nursing home a long time ago." Tears began to roll down my cheeks. The words, "useless old woman," stuck in my heart like knives. My own son, the person I had loved more than my own life, was telling me I was useless, that I was a burden, that I should be grateful for the privilege of being his slave. "And fifth truth," he said, stopping directly in front of me, "if I hear one more complaint, one more objection, one more word of protest about anything I ask you to do, you leave this house immediately. Is that absolutely clear?" I nodded between sobs, completely shattered by the cruelty of his words. "I cannot hear you," he said sarcastically. "Answer out loud." "Yes, it is clear," I managed to whisper. "Perfect now. Go prepare dinner, and I hope it is delicious, because after this little demonstration of ingratitude, you are going to have to work extra hard to regain my trust." I got up from the chair with shaking legs and headed toward the stove. As I began to prepare dinner with hands that trembled uncontrollably, I heard Fred and Jessica talking in low voices at the table behind me. "I think she needed that reminder," I heard Jessica say. Lately, she had become a little uppity. "Yes," replied Fred, "but she already got the message. There will be no more problems." That night, after serving dinner, washing dishes, and doing all my usual chores, I locked myself in my room and cried until I had no more tears left. For the first time since this nightmare began, I seriously contemplated the possibility of leaving my own home. But where could I go? How could I explain to my sister or my friends that my own son had turned me into his slave? The shame was too great. The humiliation too deep. I did not know that the next day, when they returned from their trip to Chicago, Fred would decide that words were no longer enough to keep me in my place. I did not know that he would have escalated his cruelty to a level that would change everything between us forever. I did not know I was about to discover exactly how far my own son was willing to go to ensure my total submission. The weekend Fred and Jessica spent in Chicago was the strangest of my life. For the first time in months, I woke up without the sound of the alarm clock at 5 in the morning. For the first time in so long, I drank my herbal tea slowly, without rushing, listening to the birds singing in the backyard, without having to worry about the tasks I had to complete before they got up. But the peace I should have felt was marred by a constant sense of anxiety. Even being alone in my own house, I could not relax completely. Their critical voices resonated in my head like ghostly echoes. "Mom, there is dust on this shelf. Miss Barbara, the food is too seasoned. Useless old woman who should be grateful." I meticulously fulfilled all the tasks Fred had assigned me for the weekend. I cleaned every surface of the house until it shined. I washed and ironed all their clothes with the care of someone preparing a bridal trousseau. I reorganized their closet according to a system I hoped they would find satisfactory. But as I performed each task, something began to change inside me. Maybe it was the temporary solitude. Maybe it was the accumulated exhaustion of months of constant humiliation, but I began to see my situation with a clarity I had not had before. I saw myself from the outside, a 68-year-old woman with 4 decades of successful professional career, crawling around her own house like a maid terrified of losing her job on Sunday afternoon. When I was finishing cleaning the exterior windows as Fred had ordered, my neighbor, Mrs. Rose, approached over the fence that separated our yards. "Miss Barbara," she said to me with an expression of concern, "I haven't seen you for weeks. Is everything okay?" It was a simple question, but it took me by surprise. When was the last time someone had asked me how I was as a person, not as a domestic worker? "I am fine, Rose," I answered automatically, although my voice sounded strange even to me. "You do not look well," insisted Rose, studying my face with those penetrating eyes older women develop. "You look different, thinner, more tired. And why are you cleaning windows on a Sunday afternoon? Wasn't that the day you always reserved for resting?" Rose's observation hit me like a bucket of cold water. She was right. Sundays used to be my sacred day of rest, when I stayed in pajamas until late, read novels, cooked something special just for myself. When had I lost that? When had I allowed my day of rest to become another workday to satisfy other people's demands? It is just that I have visitors this week and I want everything to be perfect. I lied. Rose looked at me with an expression suggesting she did not completely believe me, but she did not insist. After a few minutes of casual conversation about the weather and neighborhood gossip, she said goodbye and went back to her house, but her words kept ringing in my head. "You look different." That night, for the first time in months, I stood in front of the mirror in my room and really looked at myself. What I saw terrified me. The woman staring back at me was a diminished, hunched, dull version of who I had been. My hair, previously always well-groomed, looked dull and neglected. My eyes, which for decades had shone with the intelligence and confidence of a respected educator, now had the cautious expression of someone living in a constant state of alert. But the most shocking thing was not seeing the physical deterioration, but recognizing the spiritual deterioration. At some point during these months of gradual humiliations, I had stopped being Barbara Miller, the teacher, and had become something that did not even have a proper name. I was simply Mom to Fred and Miss Barbara to Jessica. Titles that now sounded more like job positions than expressions of family affection. Fred and Jessica returned Sunday night with a cheerful mood of people who had enjoyed a weekend of freedom. They arrived loaded with gift bags from Jessica's family and talking animatedly about the places they had visited, the foods they had tasted, the people they had met. Mom Fred shouted upon entering, "Bring us something to drink." The trip was long and we are thirsty. I ran to the kitchen to prepare fresh juices, feeling like a waitress serving customers who just arrived at a restaurant. While I served the drinks, they inspected my work from the weekend with the meticulousness of auditors reviewing account books. "Good Mom," said Fred after his inspection round. "The house looks acceptable, although I noticed the master bathroom window still has some water spots." My heart sank. I had spent 2 hours on that window, specifically cleaning it with 3 different products to make sure it was perfect, but apparently my definition of perfection still did not match his. And Miss Barbara added, "Jessica, my underwear is not folded the way I like." Remember I showed you the specific technique last week? I nodded silently, mentally, promising to pay more attention to her underwear folding preferences. The fact that a 30-something-year-old woman was giving me detailed instructions on how to fold her underwear was humiliating beyond words, but I had already lost the ability to be outraged by these things. The following days passed in the usual routine of housework and constant criticism, but something had changed in my perspective. Rose's words continued to resonate in my mind. "You look different." I began to observe my own life from an external perspective, as if I were an anthropologist studying power dynamics in a middle-class American home. What I saw horrified me. In the course of less than a year, I had been systematically stripped of my dignity, my autonomy, my personal identity, and my sense of self-worth. I had been reduced to a function, and not even a particularly valued function. I was like an old computer that still worked for basic tasks, but would be replaced without a second thought if something better came along. On Thursday of that week, while cleaning Fred and Jessica's room, I found something that froze me. It was a list written on a paper that had fallen behind Jessica's nightstand. The list was titled, Options for Mom, and contained 3 points. 1. St. Joseph's Nursing Home cheapest option. Research waiting lists. Sister's house in the next town. Ask if she accepts her permanently. Maintain current situation if behavior improves. The list was dated 2 weeks ago, which meant they had been actively discussing getting rid of me while I worked tirelessly to maintain their satisfaction. All my effort, all my submission, all my renunciation of my personal dignity, and they saw it simply as one option among several, probably not the preferred one. I silently put the list in my pocket and finished cleaning the room as if nothing had happened. But inside, something fundamental was changing. The despair I had felt for months began to transform into something more dangerous. Cold fury. That night, after serving dinner and washing dishes, I locked myself in my room and really thought about my situation for the first time in months. Not from the perspective of how I could improve my performance to satisfy them, but from the perspective of what options I really had. The most shocking realization was understanding that I had been operating under false premises this whole time. I had accepted Fred's narrative that this house was maintained with his money, that I was a financial burden, that my only possible contribution was housework. But was that really true? That early morning, with more mental clarity than I had had in months, I did something I had not done in a long time. Simple math. I calculated my actual expenses versus my retirement income and realized something surprising. My pension was more than enough to maintain the house if I lived alone. The huge expenses Fred constantly mentioned were largely the result of maintaining 2 additional people with expensive tastes and consumption habits I had never had. More importantly, I began to remember something that had been suppressed under layers of psychological manipulation. This house was mine not by Fred's grace, not conditionally, not as a privilege that could be revoked. It was mine by absolute legal right inherited from my mother, with deeds bearing my name and only my name. This revelation was like waking up from a dream. For months, I had been living in my own house as if I were a tolerated tenant, grateful for the privilege of cleaning and cooking for people who treated me like an unpaid maid. But the legal reality was completely different. They were the ones living in my house by my generosity. Friday morning, after Fred and Jessica left for work, I did something I had not done in months. I left the house without leaving a note explaining where I was going or when I would return. I walked to the downtown area and went directly to the notary office, where the inheritance papers had been processed when my mother died. Mrs. Miller greeted the notary, an older man I vaguely remembered from years ago. "How can I help you? I need a certified copy of the deed to my house." I told him with a clarity in my voice that surprised myself, "and I need legal confirmation of who has rights over that property." Half an hour later, I left the notary with documents confirming what deep down I had always known, but had allowed Fred to distort. The house on Oak Street was the absolute and exclusive property of Barbara Miller. There were no co-owners. There were no conditions. There were no limitations. It was mine, period. Walking back home with the documents in my purse, I felt something I had not experienced in months: power. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had something Fred did not know I had: complete knowledge of my legal rights and documentary evidence to back it up. But I also knew that having legal papers would not be enough. Fred had shown he was capable of sophisticated psychological intimidation and brutal emotional manipulation. If I simply showed him the papers and asked him to change his behavior, he would probably find new ways to maintain control. I needed a more definitive plan. I needed something that would cut off at the root any possibility of this situation continuing. During the weekend, while performing my usual household chores under the constant critical supervision of Fred and Jessica, I began to carefully plan every detail of what I would do. It would not be an emotional confrontation or an argument that could be manipulated. It would be a cold and legal execution of my rights as owner. Monday morning, while they were at work, I started preparations. First, I went to the bank and transferred all my savings to a new account I opened only in my name. Then I visited a lawyer specializing in real estate law to confirm exactly what my legal options were to end an unwanted living situation. Madam explained the lawyer, a young but competent man, as the exclusive owner of the home. You have absolute right to decide who lives there. You can give a reasonable deadline for people to leave, and if they do not do so voluntarily, you can start a legal eviction process, which is considered a reasonable deadline for family members, usually 30 days, but in cases of serious conflict, it can be less. Even 24 hours is legally acceptable if there are justified circumstances. I thought about all the months of humiliations the list I had found about sending me to a nursing home, the constant threats, the way they had turned me into a prisoner in my own home. And if they refuse to leave, then you can call the police. With property documents and a formal eviction statement, the authorities can physically remove people from the property. I left the lawyer's office feeling like a different woman from the one who had entered. For the first time in months, I had a concrete plan, solid legal backing, and the certainty that I would not have to spend another day being mistreated in my own home. I spent the rest of the week in silent preparation. I discreetly separated Fred and Jessica's belongings from mine. I organized my important documents. I prepared the legal statements I would need, and most importantly, I mentally prepared for what I knew would be the most difficult confrontation of my life. The moment arrived on Friday afternoon. Fred had had a particularly stressful week at work, which meant he had been especially critical of my domestic performance. That afternoon, when he returned home, he found a particularly trivial pretext to unleash his accumulated frustration. I had prepared roast chicken for dinner, using the same recipe I had successfully used dozens of times. But that night, Fred decided the meat was dry and tasteless, and that it was evidence my cooking was deteriorating with age. "Mom," he told me with that dangerously calm voice I had learned to fear, "I think we need to have another serious conversation about your performance here." "My performance," I repeated. And for the first time in months, there was something in my tone that was not automatic submission. Fred noticed the change immediately. His eyes narrowed as he studied me, trying to assess if I was openly challenging him. "Yes, your performance. Your work in this house has been consistently mediocre lately. The food is poorly seasoned, the cleaning is not at the level we expect, and your attitude." "My attitude?" I interrupted, surprising myself by speaking before he finished. "Do not interrupt me," roared Fred. And in that moment, I saw the flash of violence in his eyes that I had been unknowingly waiting for. He approached me with quick and deliberate steps. And for the first time since he was a child, I physically feared my son. But strangely, fear did not paralyze me as it had done for months. Instead, it gave me crystal clear clarity about what I had to do. "You are going to listen to me when I speak to you," he growled, putting his face very close to mine. "And you are going to show the respect I deserve in my house." "Your house," I repeated calmly, and something in my tone made him stop. "Yes, my house, because I maintain it. I pay the bills, He did not finish the sentence because at that moment I did something that changed everything. I smiled, a small, calm smile that contained all the months of repressed humiliation and all the anticipation of what was about to happen. Fred saw that smile, and something in his expression changed. It was as if he had recognized on an instinctive level that the balance of power had fundamentally shifted. "What are you laughing at, useless old woman?" he asked me, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. It was then that I took the documents out of my pocket, unfolded them calmly, and put them on the kitchen table where he could see them clearly. "This house is not yours, Fred," I told him, with a voice I did not recognize as mine, so calm and sure. "This house is mine, completely mine, and tomorrow morning you and Jessica are leaving." The silence that followed was absolute. Fred looked at the documents. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the documents again. It was as if his brain could not fully process what he was seeing and hearing. You cannot," he began to say. But the words faded when he understood that I could. "I have absolute legal right to decide who lives in my house." I continued with the same supernatural calm. "And I have decided that you no longer live here. Live." It was at that moment that the reality of the situation completely hit Fred. And it was when he showed exactly who he really was, beneath all the psychological manipulation. Why, instead of accepting defeat with dignity, instead of recognizing that he had abused my hospitality for months, he decided to resort to physical violence. His hands closed around my neck before I could react. The pressure was immediate and intense, cutting off my breath and sending waves of panic through my nervous system. But even as I struggled to breathe, even as I saw black spots dancing in my vision, a part of my mind remained strangely clear. "Obey me, always useless old woman," he roared while strangling me. "Now go prepare the food." And from the other side of the kitchen, I heard something that froze my blood even more than Fred's hands around my throat. Jessica's laughter, a genuine, delighted laugh, as if seeing a 68-year-old woman being strangled, was the funniest entertainment she had seen in weeks. But instead of destroying my resolve, that laugh solidified it, because in that moment, I understood that I was not dealing with family members who had lost their way or who were going through a difficult time. I was dealing with genuinely cruel people who enjoyed my suffering. When Fred finally let me go and I fell to the floor coughing and struggling to regain my breath, he stood over me with an expression of satisfaction. "Now you understand how things are going to be," he told me. "Forget about those papers. Forget about your crazy ideas. You are going to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, or next time will be worse." But as I slowly got up from the floor with my throat burning and heart pounding, one thing was absolutely clear in my mind. That had been the last time anyone would lay hands on me in my own home. The Fred who had strangled his own mother had made the biggest mistake of his life. Because he had transformed a cold legal decision into something personal and irreversible. The next day, when Fred and Jessica left for work as if nothing had happened, as if the night before they had not shown exactly who they really were, I put the last phase of my plan into motion. The marks on my neck were still fresh, painful to the touch, but my determination was stronger than any physical pain I could feel. At 8 a.m. sharp, I called the locksmith. "I need you to change all the locks on my house today," I told him. "It is urgent." At 9, I called a moving company. "I need you to pack and remove all the belongings of 2 people before 5 in the afternoon." At 10, I went to the nearest police station to make a formal complaint for domestic violence, showing the marks on my neck and providing my detailed testimony about the months of psychological abuse and the physical aggression of the night before. During all these arrangements, I felt a calm I had not experienced in months. It was as if I had finally regained control over my own life, as if I had woken up from a nightmare that had lasted too long. For the first time since Fred and Jessica had moved into my house, every decision I made was mine. Every action was directed towards my own well-being instead of towards the satisfaction of people who did not value me. At 2 in the afternoon, when the workers from the moving company finished packing and loading all of Fred and Jessica's belongings into their trucks, my house looked completely different. It was as if it had been liberated from an oppressive presence that had been choking its natural energy. The spaces looked wider, the air felt cleaner, even the light coming through the windows seemed brighter, At 3, the locksmith finished installing the new locks. He handed me the keys with a kind smile and said, "Madam, this is a very nice house. I hope now you can enjoy it in peace." He did not know how right he was. At 4, I returned to the police station to pick up the official documents of my complaint and the restraining order I had requested. The officer in charge explained that Fred was prohibited from approaching my home for a minimum period of 6 months, and that any violation of this order would result in his immediate arrest. When Fred and Jessica arrived home that afternoon, they found their belongings packed and stacked on the sidewalk in front of the house. They found the locks changed and a note stuck to the door, clearly explaining the situation. They had been formally evicted from the property. There was a police complaint against them for domestic violence, and any attempt to enter the house or contact me would result in immediate legal consequences. I heard Fred's screams from inside the house. I heard when he pounded on the door, when he shouted threats, when Jessica cried and begged, but I did not open the door. I did not respond to their screams. I did not give in to the emotional manipulation they had perfected for months. Instead, I sat in my living room on my own sofa in my own house and drank a cup of herbal tea, while listening to their voices fade as they understood that this time there was no turning back, that they had lost all the power they thought they had over me, that they had finally faced the consequences of their actions. The feeling of liberation was so intense that I cried. But they were not tears of sadness or regret. They were tears of relief, of gratitude towards myself for finally finding the strength to defend my dignity of joy, for having recovered my home. The first days after the expulsion were like rediscovering my own life. I woke up when I wanted to wake up without an alarm, without rushing, without the constant anxiety of having to fulfill an endless list of household chores. I ate my breakfast slowly, reading the entire newspaper for the first time in months. I walked through my house, enjoying the silence, the order, the peace. Little by little, I began to recover aspects of my personality that I had lost during the months of abuse. I went back to listening to music, something I had stopped doing because Fred and Jessica always had complaints about my music selection. I went back to cooking meals that I liked without having to worry about criticism or special demands. I went back to reading novels, watching my favorite TV shows, simply existing as a person with my own desires and interests instead of as a domestic function. I called my sister Rachel in the next town and told her what had happened. Her reaction was initial shock, followed by unwavering support. "Barbara," she told me, "I always knew something was wrong when you talked to me these last few months. Your voice sounded different, kind of dull, but I never imagined it was so serious. You did the right thing getting them out of your house. No one has the right to treat you that way, not even your own son." Her words confirmed something I had begun to suspect, that the abuse had been obvious to outsiders. But I had been so immersed in the situation that I had lost the perspective to fully recognize it. I also spoke with some of my former colleagues from schoolwomen who had known me for decades as a competent and respected professional. Their reactions were similar: shock, indignation, and total support for my decision. Barbara, my former principal, Mrs. Linda, told me, "You are one of the most dedicated teachers I have known. For 40 years, you demonstrated your strength, your intelligence, your capability. That your own son could not see, that is his loss, not yours." These conversations helped me rebuild my sense of self-esteem. For months, I had begun to believe Fred and Jessica's narratives about my incompetence, my uselessness, my dependence on their generosity. But listening to people who knew me from before this nightmare reminded me of who I really was. A strong, intelligent, capable woman who had had a successful career and had raised a son, although that son had turned out to be a disappointment. About a month after the eviction, Fred appeared at my door. I saw him arrive from my living room window, walking slowly down the street with an expression I had not seen on his face in years: humility. He rang the doorbell softly, not like the aggressive demands I had gotten used to. I did not open the door. Instead, I spoke to him from inside. "Fred, there is a restraining order against you. You cannot be here." "Mom," he said, and his voice sounded different, too smaller, less sure. "I just want to talk to you. I want to apologize." "No, there is nothing to talk about, and your apologies come too late. Please, Mom, I have been thinking about everything that happened. I realize I was wrong. I want to fix things between us." It was exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that had worked successfully for years. The contrite, repentant Fred who promised to change if I only gave him another chance. But this time, I had the perspective I had lacked before. "Fred," I told him, "through the closed door, you had 35 years of opportunities to treat me with respect when you decided to put your hands on my neck, when you decided to call me a useless old woman, when you decided to turn me into your maid. You lost all future opportunities. But I am your son," he insisted. And I could hear tears in his voice. "A son who respects his mother." I replied, "You demonstrated that you are a man who abuses older women when you think you can get away with it. Those are two very different things." He stayed outside for almost an hour, alternating between pleas and veiled threats. But I did not give in. I did not open the door. I did not change my mind. I did not allow guilt or emotional manipulation to convince me to give him another chance. Eventually, he left, and that was the last time he tried to contact me directly. Through mutual acquaintances, I found out that he and Jessica had to rent a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, that they were struggling financially, that their relationship was under stress because of economic difficulties. Part of me felt tempted to feel sorry for them, but I reminded myself that they were experiencing the natural consequences of their own decisions. Today, 6 months after recovering my house, I can honestly say that I am happier than I have been in years. My life is quiet, orderly, peaceful. I get up when I want, eat what I want. I watch what I want on TV. I have visitors when I feel like it. I go out when I feel like it. And I live according to my own schedule instead of according to other people's demands. I have reconnected with friends I had lost during the months of isolation. I have returned to participate in church and community activities. I have started teaching adult literacy classes at the community center, using the skills I developed during my career as a teacher. More importantly, I have recovered my sense of personal dignity. I no longer walk with hunched shoulders. I no longer speak in a low voice for fear of disturbing someone. I no longer live in a state of constant alert, waiting for criticism or demands. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that it is never too late to defend your own dignity. No matter how old you are, no matter who is mistreating you, you always have the right and the responsibility to say enough. You always have the power to change a situation that is not tolerable, even when that situation involves the people closest to you. I also learned that family abuse can be incredibly subtle and gradual. It did not start with physical violence. It started with small disrespects, constant criticism, and the gradual erosion of my personal boundaries. By the time it reached physical violence, I had already been conditioned to accept levels of mistreatment that would have been unthinkable at the beginning. That is why it is so important to recognize early signs. When someone begins to control your time, when they begin to constantly criticize your work or your appearance, when they begin to isolate you from your friends and activities, when they begin to make you feel guilty for having needs or desires of your own. If you are watching this video and recognize some of these signs in your own life, I want you to know that you are not alone, that you have options even when you feel you do not, that you deserve respect and dignity, regardless of your age, your economic situation, or your relationship with the people who are mistreating you. I also want you to know that seeking help is not betraying your family. Protecting yourself is not being selfish. Setting boundaries is not being cruel. You have the fundamental right to live without abuse, and that right does not disappear because the person hurting you is your son, your husband, your daughter-in-law, or any other relative. My story ended well because I was lucky enough to have legal and financial resources that allowed me to take decisive action. but I understand that not all people are in the same situation. If you are facing abuse but feel you have no options, I encourage you to seek out local support organizations for victims of domestic violence. Talk to social workers. Consult with lawyers about your rights. Connect with support groups for people in similar situations. Help exists, but sometimes we have to be active in seeking it. And the first step is always to recognize that what is happening is not right, that you deserve better, and that you have the right to fight for a more dignified life. If my story touched you in any way, if it helped you see your own situation more clearly, if it gave you hope that change is possible, even in the most difficult circumstances, I ask you to help share this message with other people who may need to hear it. Subscribe to the Elderly Stories channel because every week I bring real stories of people who, like me, went through difficult times but found the strength to change their lives. These are not invented or dramatized stories. They are real experiences of real people who want to share their lessons, learn to help others who may be going through similar situations. Like this video if you think it is important for people to know about these issues. Social media algorithms only show content that has a good response from the audience, so your like helps more people find these stories when they need them. But more importantly, leave me a comment. Tell me what you thought of this story. Have you gone through something similar? Do you know someone who is facing family problems like the ones I faced? What part of my story impacted you the most? Do you agree with the decisions I took, or do you think I should have done something different? Your comments are incredibly important to me, not only because they help me understand how these stories are affecting people, but because they create a support community for all of us here. When you share your experience in the comments, you help other people who are reading to feel less alone with their own problems. And do not forget to check the other videos on the channel. We have stories about all kinds of difficult situations, problems with adult children, marital conflicts, economic difficulties, health problems, loss of loved ones. There is wisdom in every story lessons that can be applied to many different life situations. If this channel is helping you in any way, if these stories are making a difference in your life or in the life of someone, you know you can also support us through thanks. It is a form of donation that helps us enormously with the costs of producing these videos. Making this content requires a lot of time and resources. I have to investigate each story carefully, write the scripts, record the videos, edit them, and upload them. There are also costs for equipment, software, and other technical expenses that are necessary to maintain the quality these important stories deserve. Every contribution through thanks allows us to keep the channel running and continue bringing daily videos with real stories that can inspire, educate, and help people who are facing their own challenges. Your support makes it possible for us to continue sharing these experiences that otherwise might remain in silence. When you support the channel, you are not only helping with production costs, you are investing in the creation of a platform where people can share their most difficult stories without shame, where we can learn from each other, where we can find inspiration and hope in the experiences of people who have overcome situations that seemed impossible. Every dollar you donate goes directly to improving the quality of the videos, to being able to dedicate more time to researching and writing these stories, and to expanding the reach of the channel so that more people can find the support and inspiration they need. Remember, you are never alone in your struggles. There is always someone who has gone through something similar. There are always lessons to learn. There is always hope for the future. My story began with humiliation and abuse, but ended with dignity and freedom. Your story can also have a different ending than seems possible now. Thank you for joining me on this journey, for listening to my story, for being part of this community of people who believe it is always possible to change our lives for the better. See you in the next video, and remember, it is never too late to defend your own dignity.